This is Foreign Policy and Anti-Racism Today. So today's event is organized by Canada-China Focus, which you'll be hearing more about shortly, and is co-sponsored by the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. And we're going to hear from our esteemed panelists, and following that, there's going to be a discussion and a Q&A. Where you can pose your questions in the Q&A box. We're also going to try and live stream this to Facebook, so you can share that link when that's up, and we'll be recording the event for YouTube as well. So I just want to let everybody know that the chat is going to be open at the beginning of the event during the introductions, so please use that as an opportunity to say hi and let us know where you're tuning in from. And as always, keep your comments respectful and cordial. This event really comes at a really critical time when we need to be connecting the dots for a deeper understanding of our foreign policy, which, many believe is the key to building solidarity that comes from seeing how these issues are very much related, whether it's xenophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, or promotion of mining interests that displace Indigenous people. Racism pervades our foreign policy, but is something that's really rarely discussed. And so I'm really hoping that there's going to be many more discussions like this to follow. I just want to give a special thanks to Professor John Price for helping us to gather panelists for this important event, as well as to our moderator, Timothy Stanley, who I'm now going to introduce, and he'll take it from here. So Timothy Stanley is Professor Emeritus of Anti-Racism at the University of Anti-Racism Education at the University of Ottawa. He's an award-winning historian of racism and Chinese Canadian experience. In 1976 to 78, he studied at the Beijing Languages Institute and Peking University as a participant in the official Canada-China Exchange Scholarship. And he's a founding member of the Canada-China Focus Advisory Committee. Welcome, Timothy.
Thank you, Bianca, for that generous introduction. Good evening, everybody, and I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar. Originally, I was just going to be the moderator for this event, but because as will become evident, one of our panelists was unable to attend at the very last minute, I am also becoming a kind of semi-panelist, so I'd ask you to bear with me in that light. I'm speaking to you today from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, and we'd like to acknowledge that we live and work on the territories of Indigenous nations, and we honor their elders, knowledge keepers, and leaders as the guardians of these lands, past, present, and future. As Bianca mentioned, today's seminar is being organized by Canada-China Focus with the support of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute. And CCF originally came together to create a safe, nonpartisan space to discuss China-Canada relations. Since that time, we've become deeply concerned by the upsurge in anti-Asian racism and Sinophobia in Canada that has been shaping both public discourse and government policies, and having adverse effects on the communities across Canada. We have early recognized similarities in this situation to the Islamophobia that shaped public opinion and the actions of Canadian security agencies in recent memory, and more recently have sensed that similar things appear to be taking place with respect to anti-Palestinian racism and anti-Semitism. Tonight's panel, we hope, is consequently an occasion to explore the likenesses and differences between these racisms, their effects on public discourse and on government responses, while helping to identify common grounds from which to strengthen all movements against racism. Now, racism is commonly understood as individual expressions of prejudice and ignorance, or the violence of damaged individuals. But as I've long argued, it's better understood as multiple overlapping structures of exclusion. Breaking through these structures begins with the resistance of the excluded and continues by engaging with their experiences to transform our own knowledge and understandings. And this requires actively listening to and taking seriously how excluded people themselves describe the realities of their lives. It's important to recognize that for many of our panelists, and indeed members of our audience, the issues of racism that will be discussing are not abstract ones, but are the stuff of their lives. And what they have to say may at times be difficult to hear, and our own reactions may at times be fraught as a result. However, we need to remember that understanding only comes through respectful engagement across differences. With this in mind, I'm truly honored to introduce our panelists for tonight. Monia Mazigh is an academic, award-winning Canadian author and human rights activist. She writes in English and French and has authored a memoir, 3 novels, an essay, and a collection of short stories. Her book, Gendered Islamophobia, was shortlisted for the 2023 Governor General's Award for English Language Nonfiction. Jamila Ewais is the lead researcher for the Anti-Racism Program of the Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East Foundation. The CJPME focuses on anti-Palestinian racism in Canada and its intersection with other forms of racism. It also advocates for the rights of the Palestinian movement and seeks to create public awareness of racism in Canada by monitoring and combating manifestations of racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. Alejandro Paz is an Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Toronto Scarborough. His 2018 book, Latinos in Israel, examined the unexpected ways that non-citizen immigrants became potential citizens. His current research focuses on Israeli English online journalism and its impact on North American public opinion. And he's a founding co-chair of the Hearing Palestine Initiative at the University of Toronto, and also to help found the Jewish Faculty Network, which he serves on the steering committee. We've asked each participant to talk for about 10 to 12 minutes so as to allow ample time for discussion afterwards. If you have questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A, and we will try to share them, as many of them as possible, with the panelists later in the webinar. Unfortunately, our fourth panelist, Dr. Xiaobei Chen of the Department of Anthropology and Sociology of Carleton University, has been unable to join us at the last minute this evening. Dr. Chen, I understand, was going to share with us her findings on the chilly climate that Chinese Canadian professors and Chinese Canadians more generally are experiencing because of the current China panic. Instead, I'll discuss some of my own research on the history of anti-Chinese racism in Canada and its effects, including on the Sinophobia, that appear to be increasingly shaping government policies. 2023 marked the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Immigration Act, also known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. This act effectively ended all Chinese immigration to Canada from 1923 until its repeal in 1947. It also required that all those of Chinese origins, especially including the Canadian-born, obtain a certificate of registration with the federal government, which they then had to carry with themselves at all times. Failure to produce a valid certificate made the person subject to fines and imprisonment, and in the case of non-citizens, to deportation. The Chinese are the only group in Canadian history singled out for a measure of this kind. And at the time, they were the largest non-Indigenous racialized group in the country. The effects of this act were devastating. Between 1923 and 1947, only 44 Chinese people were admitted to Canada as immigrants, at the same time that 1.5 million Europeans were. By 1941, the Chinese population had fallen to a little bit under 35,000 people, less than 0.2% of the total population. The majority of Chinese in Canada at the time were married men whose families were in China and whose family members have been unable to come because of immigration regulations. These men consequently were condemned to years of isolation and loneliness, while their families in China were trapped in civil war and Japanese invasion. The Canadian-born never fully recovered from being permanently marked as outsiders in the country of their birth. In later years, many of them did almost anything to so-called fit in, including denying much of their own Chineseness. I know this from my own family history. My mother, who is second-generation Chinese Canadian, born and raised in Montreal, had to register under the Act at the age of 8. She long refused, in her later life, to be actively involved in the Chinese Canadian community. At the same time, she kept her certificate with her until shortly before her death, along with those of her siblings who were also born in Canada. So deep in the back of their mind, there was always this idea that somehow she didn't really quite belong. Interestingly, she kept the certificates, but was unable to even keep a photograph of her father. The Chinese Exclusion Act, however, was not an exception. At the time of its passage, Canada was an explicitly white supremacist country. The government was organizing the cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples through the residential school system, while it was taking active measures to exclude non-whites from entering the country. The Exclusion Act was deliberately designed to prevent a Chinese population from developing a white Canada, and other actions blocked the immigration of people from Japan, from India, as well as of Blacks. Yet Canada was at the time, and still is, inexorably linked to people and things Chinese. It was Chinese workers and sailors from Canton whose actions in 1788-89 enabled the British sea captain John Meares to establish the British claim to the Pacific coast. Chinese workers are celebrated for building the Canadian Pacific Railway, but the head tax on Chinese immigration paid for the railway. Today, Canadians of all origins enjoy the right to vote because Chinese Canadians, along with many others, struggled for this right for the better part of a century. Even today, we're linked to China through the cell phones in our pockets and the surge search for solutions to the problems of our age, including climate change. In my own research, I have shown that Chinese exclusion was directly linked to the British and later Canadian settler colonialism that created the country. The whole point of this project was to transform the territories of Indigenous peoples into the private property of people from Britain and their locally born descendants, and later from other whites from Europe. Chinese property owners threatened white dominance, especially in British Columbia. And by 2014, that province had enacted 223 separate pieces of anti-Chinese legislation. That's 1 out of every 10 acts passed in the province's history. These acts not only blocked the Chinese from voting, from preempting land, from participating in many sectors of the economy, as well as from working for the government and its contractors. In 1885, John A. Macdonald extended Chinese exclusion federally by taking the vote away from anybody, quote, of Chinese or Mongolian race, unquote, for fear that Chinese property owners in BC would control the vote there. His very next piece of legislation imposed the head tax on Chinese immigration. By the early 1920s, resolutions from groups like the Great War Veterans Association and the Trades and Labor Congress of Canada were calling for the exclusion of all Chinese and Japanese immigrants, as well as for blocking them from owning land. Canada was to be of, for, and by white people. Although the legislated nature of anti-Chinese racism, and indeed most other racisms in Canada, have largely disappeared, the effects of Chinese exclusion continue today. Of the 1.7 million self-identified Chinese in Canada, fewer than 60,000, or 3.7% of the total, are third generation or more. Despite being one of the oldest population groups in the country, Chinese Canadians are consequently underrepresented in virtually every walk of Canadian life, and especially in government and politics. While Canadians are daily inundated with information on our links to people and things European, our knowledge of China is almost non-existent. While the exclusion of the Chinese and others, including Indigenous peoples, continue to shape the cultural landscapes of Canada. This ranges from the way buildings are designed, to the grid patterns of cities, to institutions such as our government systems and universities, to the names of landmark cities and towns and streets, which all bear the impact of a vast project of removing Indigenous peoples and keeping non-Europeans out. So today I'm speaking to you in English, a language that was imposed on this territory by excluding the Anishinaabewin that was spoken here for millennia. Today, the concrete of the city of Ottawa literally paves over the presence of the Algonquin people. And while there are occasional Chinese language signs on restaurants and in heritage districts of Chinatown, if you look around Canadian cities, you would not know that the Chinese have been present since before the country came into existence. This also means that when read against the streetscapes of Canadian cities, Chinese bodies and those mistaken for being Chinese are read as not belonging, as newcomers whose presence needs explanation in ways that my apparently white body does not. For example, I myself have never been asked where I am really from. The consequence of this became apparent during the COVID pandemic, when Chinese Canadians overwhelmingly reported being scapegoated for the pandemic. Indeed, within a few months of its beginning, 60% of Chinese Canadians surveyed reported having changed their habits because they were being harassed or were afraid of being harassed. Extrapolated for the total population, that makes a group the size of the city of Ottawa. So think of it, 1 million people living in fear, yet there was very little in the way of responses. We've also seen that the idea that Chinese people somehow do not belong fuels the current China panic that appears to be driving such things as the foreign influence discussions and the thinking of Canadian security services. While we often think of the deterioration of Canada-China relations as stemming from the Two Michaels affair, my colleague John Price has shown that months before, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service had aligned itself with the anti-China initiatives of the Trump administration. In discourses that disturbingly echo those of the 1920s, we've seen so far unproven allegations destroy people's lives. So 2 researchers who developed the first Ebola vaccine were fired from Winnipeg's National Microbiology Lab for allegedly sharing secrets with Chinese institutions, even though sharing research with other labs is common practice in immunology. After accused of being a Chinese police station, the 50-year-old Chinese Canadian Family Services Organization in Montreal, the major Chinese immigrant services organizations in that city, has lost all of its funding. A Hydro-Quebec engineer, Yuesheng Wang, has been charged with espionage, apparently for leaking Chinese Quebec Hydro battery technology secrets to the Chinese, even though they hired him in the first place because Chinese battery technology is more developed than it is in Canada. In a move that has occurred without any public discussions, CSIS now has officials in Canadian research institutions, in research universities, reviewing professors' grants, supposedly to ensure that they are not leaking secrets to places like China. As Professor Chen can attest much better than I, it is clear that it's not clear that these agents understand either how university research is conducted or have much in the way of anti-racist understanding. It's the reality today that many Chinese Canadian professors and Chinese Canadians more generally are feeling that they are once again being subjected to ongoing government surveillance. Meanwhile, a broad coalition of groups, including the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, has warned against Bill C-70, the foreign interference bill that is now being debated in the House of Commons. This bill, they argue, has been hastily conceived and requires major changes to be compliant with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. At the time when we need to deepen our understanding of the complexities of China, the Canadian government has actually cut back on all of its diplomatic funding of diplomats and its China experts amongst experts for elsewhere in the world. And instead of in being able to develop our understanding and our own links to people and things Chinese, public discourse has become so polarized that it's almost impossible to productively discuss either the realities of anti-Chinese racism or what a fully informed anti-racist and engaged China strategy would look like. This is a polarization I fear that, as our other panelists will attest, applies to other groups as well. So if that, by way of an extended, and apologize for a bit of a long extended introduction, I'm now going to call on Monia Mazigh.
Well, thank you so much, Tim, for this, yes, a bit long, but never enough, I guess, to learn from historians, but that makes it very also very actual and very relevant to what we are still hearing and witnessing today. Well, again, thank you, Bianca, for for having us on this panel, and for Canada China Focus and the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute for organizing and sponsoring this event. My name is Monia Mazigh, and I am coming to you here from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. So I will actually focus my presentation today on Islamophobia. My understanding is my co-panelist Jamila will be focusing more on the anti-Palestinian racism. However, I think, I'm sure you will very quickly notice that there are a lot of intersection between the two, and there are also both of them somehow feed into each other. So if I don't, talk about anything, I really hope, or I'm sure that Jamila will be covering, the topics much in a complete manner. So I will start with Islamophobia. Of course, when we talk about Islamophobia, the first thing that would come to our mind is that it started becoming some sort of a notion, or maybe known or used by the media more or less after 9/11, after the attack of 9/11. However, Islamophobia is a very, very sort of an old, actually, concept. Even the term itself, it had been mentioned that there is this Orientalist painter from French background who coined that term in French, and basically I'm not very much sure if that's really the case, but nevertheless, even the word itself has given rise to a lot of controversy, a lot of Islamophobia again itself, or anti-Islamic feeling by some people saying, no, this is not a real word. So just if we spend the whole panel on the semantic, probably it won't be enough. Nevertheless, it's basically, I will read you some definition about Islamophobia. Basically, it's really this irrational fear that is perceived of people who are Muslim, or people who are perceived like Muslim, and that would eventually conduct to violence or harassment, or any sort of abuse that would target the person who is Muslim or perceived as Muslim. So that's maybe very simple. The University of Berkeley in California is one of the first university who define the word very well, and I can refer you to that definition. And even before that, the Runnymede report in Britain, sometime I think in the 90s, was one of the first one to give this definition. And I think the more we experience Islamophobia, the better, I guess, we came to understand its definition, of course, because we can see it, how it is being implemented and how it is exerted on people. So I was saying that it goes even beyond 9/11. Actually, if you look at the crusade, during the Middle Ages that happened from Europe, the first kind of a huge war from Europe going to the Middle East, actually going to Jerusalem to liberate Jerusalem from the infidels. That was, in a way, justified by Islamophobia. That was justified by the fact that Muslims are not real, they are imposters, their prophet is a liar, and basically, we need to clean the places of worship that belong to the Christian. But and then, of course, I mean, even beyond that crusade, if you think about basically the war in the Gulf, the first Gulf War in 1991, I personally think that it is really the time of our modern and contemporary era where Islamophobia took this this image and this understanding that we are watching today, especially with the Salman Rushdie, with afterward, and even before Salman Rushdie fatwa, that clashes between the Muslim world and the West, and then even before with the Iranian Revolution and the portrayal of Khomeini in the media and his portrayal as, you know, yeah, so all this came to shape in the popular imagination what is a Muslim, basically. And after shaping this image, also giving this sort of basically justification for people, individual in the street, to protect themselves or to clean the public space from this presence, this pollution, whether it is men with beard or whether it is women with niqab or with headscarf. Those are mostly like religious symbols that came to represent Muslims. So let's focus more on something closer, I mean, here home, but also closer in time. And I will be talking about how Islamophobia shaped our political media, and basically also you can find it university education sphere. So I would focus on these three kind of levels. So Islamophobia, basically, when it comes to political, just immediately after 9/11, Canada was the second country that passed its anti-terrorism legislation immediately after the American, what they called over there, the Patriot Act. We call it here the anti-terrorism legislation. And within 2 months, we had our legislation, even though there were not single act of violence committed on the Canadian soil, but we did it. And that piece of legislation, I think many Canadians at that time were eager to accept it and to really accept it as a way to protect themselves, without really asking who were the one being targeted by this legislation, and why do we need a piece of legislation that is going to target a very specific part of the population. I mean, if you think about it, and a lot of constitutional lawyer at that time, and still, I'm still here on that opinion, that this piece of legislation is inherently racist, because many criminal lawyer insisted on that our criminal code in Canada has everything in place and has all the clauses to deal with all sort of act, and especially, you know, kind of hate or politically or ideologically kind of political act. However, the fact that we felt our politician insisted that we needed a special law on the surface to make us feel more protected, but inside to target a specific community, in this case, the Muslim community, that's inherently racist, but of course, and unconstitutional according to me, but according to many views. But of course, we know that it's still there. And actually in 2015, Stephen Harper, Prime Minister of Canada, made those procedure and those law even more stricter and intrusive, and with the anti-terrorism legislation 2.0. So that's on a political level. And of course, there are many other examples I can give you, like the security certificate targeting, especially after 9/11, exclusively Arab Muslim men. This idea that Muslim men are a lone wolf, their description in the media as sleeper agent, so you don't know when they will be they are kind of hiding, and then all of a sudden there will be this act of violence. So basically, it means continuously being afraid of Muslim presence. For women, the type of Islamophobia, and Islamophobia is a gendered concept. So for men, it looks like more, violent men, brown men who look like Muslim, even sometimes when they are Sikh, and that can give the impression that they are Muslim, and of course target to Islamophobia and to prejudices. And for women, what came to represent the epitome of Islamophobia is the wear of a hijab or the headscarf, and eventually it went even to the niqab. And we know in 2015 we had a whole federal election talking about the niqab, without any politician even knowing how many women in Canada are wearing a niqab, which is, by the way, a couple of hundred, not even more. So all this to tell you that we have this political sort of produced Islamophobia, where there is constantly the fear of either man or the representation of women as submissive, as oppressed. They need to be saved, they need to be liberated from their archaic sort of tradition and faith. When it comes to other places where we can see Islamophobia, and this is some sort of a trickle-down effect from the political sort of legislations. If you take, for example, CBSA, which is the Canadian Border Services Agency, there are a lot of Canadian, when they want to travel or when they want to come to Canada, they will be prevented from entering or leaving the country. And especially this is going to become more known as the no-fly list. If you are a Canadian citizen in Canada, you cannot know if you are on the no-fly list or not unless you are stopped from boarding the plane. And there are many, many classes of people being on the no-fly list. So people who cannot board the plane, but people who can board the plane with extra scrutiny, with people who are going to be surveilled and keep watch. So different levels. And again, there is no way to know that in advance and there is no way even later on to challenge. I mean, I know there were some attempts to challenge that, but a lot of people remain, in sort of unclear about their situation, how they are. And this is happening in Canada, and a lot of people, probably Canadian, wouldn't even know about it, or would think that, yeah, this is the price we pay for an extra bit of security. But what we should know is that this security that some people will enjoy is coming at the expense of the security and the safety of other people who are racialized, and in this case, Muslim. I will talk about how also, for example, in Quebec, how we had a whole legislation to ban Muslim women from being a teacher, from being police officer, from being crown prosecutor. This is not something, I mean, people would say, yes, that would include also Sikh and symbols and Catholic symbols and, some religious symbols like kippah, but definitely the whole legislation has been with the, everybody agree on that, targeting and having in mind Muslim women. And today there is a shortage of teachers in Quebec, and still women wearing hijab cannot be teachers today, and those who were teachers before the law cannot get promoted. They are not being like in the classroom teaching. They have been assigned to some administrative position, and that's still happening today in Canada. I will maybe end, and later on I can address this if that came into the question with the media, for example, some examples from the media, how the media helped shape this and normalize this sort of Islamophobia. by creating, I mentioned already this, some of these title or some of these adjective of lone wolf or of sleeper agent cells, or yeah, some of these examples. But I mean, today we are seeing it coming to another extent when it comes to the genocide happening in Gaza, for instance, how people who are who happen to be from Gaza, very recently I was reading about the New York Times calling them a score of people dead. So it's not even, usually score, you use it for animals, and it's not even the exact number. So the media participate fully in this dehumanization of Muslim. It happened a long time ago. Hollywood is very well known for that. Continuation of it in the movie, the representation of the violent terrorist brown Muslim man, and the woman who is usually sometimes sexualized, who happen to be Muslim and who need to be saved by usually white men from the brown man. After in Afghanistan, for example, the notion of victims changed during the war on terror. So whoever is killed, whenever there is a target by the American, so whoever Muslim are close to that target, they won't be considered as victim. 2 days ago, I was reading on the National Post, who is a victim anyway, talking about the massacre of the Nusayrat. That means that if you are close to a target, then you are not a victim, basically. So this idea, even to collateral damage, it's even denied to Muslim, making them under, subhuman, not even human. And again, the media will participate in this, perpetuating those sort of racist tropes and very Islamophobic tropes. When it comes to education, we have seen this a lot happening in the schools, in the university for many, many years. The Canadian students, when it comes, for example, McGill, I give one example. When I first came to Canada, and then later on, for many, many years, the students struggle always to get a place of worship where they can pray. And this is not only McGill, many other universities. Maybe today it's something that a lot of students do not know because we moved up to another level, but I think that can tell you a bit of an idea of how Islamophobia worked, whether it is to remove those this presence in the public space, or to shape also somehow the curriculum in a way that Islam is not going to be taught, or very old concepts are going to be shared with the student. But I will stop here, and maybe if we can, if there are any other question or any element that I didn't go, I will take another opportunity to address it. Thank you.
Thank you, Monia. It's very difficult to reduce such an important and vast subject to a short time, as I myself can attest. With that in mind, I'm going to call on Jamila Ewais to talk about, I guess, anti-Palestinian racism.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Monia. And thank you for having me and the CGBME Foundation, basically. And definitely there's so much intersection between Islamophobia and anti-Palestinian racism. And I'm not gonna repeat what Monia said, because basically it's everything that goes against against Muslims living here in Canada also can be applied to Palestinian living in Canada or living in Palestine. So I would talk a little bit about Canada's, let's say, systemic racism against Palestinians. And I'm going to focus a little bit on basically like government and its foreign relations with Palestine, or basically. So in May 2024, several human rights organizations submitted a proposal for an intersectional approach to anti-Palestinian racism, APR, to be integrated into Canada's anti-racism strategy for 2024-2028. This proposal emphasized recognizing settler colonialism as a settler feature and foundation of racism both within Canada and Israel. The organizations argued for a direct acknowledgement of the connection between support for Zionism and anti-Palestinian racism. However, the strategy released on June 8, 2024 didn't reflect these suggestions. It mentioned Islamophobia and grouped bigotry against Palestinians under this category, which is a mischaracterization. On May of this year as well, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau defined Zionism as the Jewish people's right to self-determination in their ancestral homeland, portraying Israel as a sanctuary established post-Holocaust state. He asserted that one could support both Zionism and the creation of a Palestinian state, reinforcing Canada's unwavering support for Israel and its depiction as a historically and religiously justified entity, despite the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Canada's foreign policy concerning Palestine underscores a racial contract that upholds Israeli settler colonialism and depicts Palestinian as inferior, as like what Abu Laban and Muhammad Ayyash describe. This policy is backed by a historical narrative of racialization in Europe, which justify Western foreign policies toward Palestine, leading to a broad acceptance of Zionism. This acceptance has fostered a legal and institutional framework in Israel that perpetuate apartheid-like conditions by racially characterizing its Jewish citizens. And in Canada, anti-Palestinian racism is basically supported by multiple anti-Palestinian Islamophobic groups, including far-right group, evangelical groups, and at the same time, pro-Israeli groups like B'nai B'rith, Sija, and many other groups as well. Canada's policy stance on Palestine question is not neutral, as some advocates and policymakers actually make it seem like. Historically, Canada has supported Israeli colonial interest in Palestine, demonstrated by its influential role in the 1947 partition plan and its consistent pro-Israeli voting patterns at the United Nations. This is also clear with Canada's unwavering support for Israel that includes its refusal to acknowledge the genocide in Gaza, its backlash against the BDS movement, and its promotion of Israeli Islamic products, which actually constitute violation of human rights. The defunding of UNRWA as well depends on Israeli narrative against the Palestinians. Routinely, and at the same time, Canada routinely classifies Palestinians as terrorists. Out of the 77 registered terrorist entities on Canada's terrorist list, 57 are Arab and Muslim entities, notably Palestinians, who make up less than 1.1% of the Muslim world population, have 9 organizations listed. Basically, almost all armed Palestinian resistance groups and factions are categorized as terrorist organizations in Canada. The treatment of Palestinians extends to immigration policies. By May 2024, and let's take only like the last 9 months, Canada had approved only a small number of Palestinians for entry from Gaza, and it actually had like really strict measures for people who wanna come from Gaza and escape the genocide. And this comes in a stark contrast to the large numbers of Israeli admitted, including during emergency evacuation. By December 2023, we're talking about 800 Israelis admitted in Canada since October 2023, basically. This disparity underscores the systemic bias in Canadian policies, which also extends to military support. With Canada authorizing significant military export to Israel, even during periods of intense conflict, and its refusal to impose two-ways arm embargo as well. In terms of arms trade, between October 2023 and February 2024, Canada authorized $28.5 million in new military exports to Israel, despite the ongoing genocide again. surpassing the previous 30-year annual high of 26 million in 2021. Canada's refusal to acknowledge systemic discrimination against Palestinians as well has effectively excluded such issues from broader discussion on equity, diversity, and inclusion, often labeling pro-Palestinian advocacy as hate speech or anti-Semitic or violent. The lack of acknowledgement and the active suppression of pro-Palestinian voices is a significant issue in Canada, as we said, affecting various sectors, including education, media, and public policy, in addition to the private sector. And this systemic racism makes it challenging to discuss, let alone address discrimination against Palestinians. Basically, now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we do. So the anti-racism program of the CGBME Foundation, ARPCF, was launched in early 2024 to tackle these issues by elevating public awareness and challenging racism, xenophobia, and discrimination. The program focusing on APR is a distinct form of racism based on the ACLA, or like Arab Canadian Law Association definition of anti-Palestinian racism. Basically, anti-Palestinian racism is like all the effort that silences, excludes, erase, stereotype, defame, or dehumanize Palestinians or their narrative. At the same time, it takes various forms, including denying the Nakba, basically like that could include like celebrating the establishment of Israel without actually acknowledging the Nakba narrative, justifying violence against Palestinian. So basically by saying, well, it's they started it, it's October 7th, started it on October 7th, or like they're hiding under between civilians or like under civilian buildings, something like that. Failing to acknowledge Palestinian as indigenous people, the ancestral homeland, with a collective identity, belonging, and rights in relation to the occupied and historic Palestine, erasing the human rights and equal dignity and worth of Palestinians. Also, it includes excluding or pressuring others to exclude Palestinian perspectives. Palestinians and their allies are usually defamed as anti-Semitic and at the same time terrorist threat, or they're opposed to democracy, they're homophobic, misogynist, jihadist, Islamist, etc., etc., etc. We see that it's crucial to recognize APR, understand its motivation, tactic, actors, and the chilling effect it generates. Anti-Palestinian racism is a politically driven ideology targeted against Palestinians, and that's what actually distinguishes it. It's not, well, it has some cultural element, but like its core, it's basically like a political narrative against the Palestinians, even though it always tried to depoliticize itself. It operates on systemic, institutional, individual, and global levels. Failing to acknowledge the issue impedes the prediction and prevention of hate crimes against pro-Palestine. For example, last week we had an arson incident against like someone who had like a Palestine panel or like something like that in London, Ontario. So our goal include advocating for policy change to address and penalize anti-Palestinian racism, securing formal recognition of it in Canada, and at the same time conducting research to assess the prevalence and underreporting of antisemitism, because like underreporting of anti-Palestinian racism is actually a huge issue. Most people don't report what they go through, basically. And I think, so the last thing I feel I want to say is just like we have been developing advocacy and policy influence program to engage with policymakers to actually try to make legislative changes or like preventing anti-Palestinian racism change legislation from passing as well. And at the same time, we're trying like to create more incident reports, statements, and resources about like anti-Palestinian racism, just like to create awareness about it, because it's still like unacknowledged. It's something that people don't actually realize that it's happening, and it's still something new, and people started like feeling it more and more like recently. So that's why we need to create more awareness on it. I'm gonna leave it here. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jamila. I'll now call on Alejandro Paz.
Thank you so much to everyone and for the wonderful organization, and thanks to our audience and Jamila and Monia, Tim, for your really stimulating presentations. It's actually perfect to pick up where Jamila left off. And also to remind, maybe say quickly, that even Jewish people in Canada are not immune from anti-Palestinian racism. It's amazing how when you start to stand with Palestinian solidarity, the conservative Zionist Jewish organizations that were named before, CJ, B'nai B'rith, and those people who are partisans of them start to doubt that we are actually Jewish, right? So it's almost, it's incredible, and they say horrible things about us. They call us all kinds of names, simply because we see our past as something that requires us to stand with Palestine right now, especially during a genocide, and previously to stand against apartheid policies, to stand against dispossession, to stand against oppression. And that is not something that makes us less Jewish. That makes us very Jewish. That is how we understand our history. And it's very important to us. So it's also very useful to go after Jamila, who was mentioned some of the ways that Canadian foreign policy, I'll just share my screen. Canadian foreign policy has, as you put it, upheld Israeli superiority, a kind of racial contract that upholds many of these Israeli policies going back to even before the Nakba and the UN vote for partition and so on. And I also want to mention, I liked Tim's definition of racism as multiple overlapping structures of exclusion. I think Monia and Jamila showed that very well in your presentations. And here I'm going to be speaking not so much about classical anti-Semitism, but rather as part of an analysis of power and domination, what is now called the new anti-Semitism, or was called the new anti-Semitism, where it comes from and how it kind of gets plugged into a new phase in Israeli settler colonialism. So I absolutely agree with all the panelists that we need an analysis of settler colonialism, both here in Canada, as well as in Palestine. So this is a panel on foreign policy. So I'd like to start with now a somewhat outdated story about the University of Toronto, since now the University of Toronto is the home of news about our wonderful People's Circle for Palestine, also known as the Encampment. Because I want to show how a certain claim about anti-Semitism that is used by Israeli leaders and Israeli lobby groups and advocates abroad comes to impact us here. And this claim about anti-Semitism emerged in the 1970s and came to be called the new anti-Semitism. And that's what I'm mostly going to be talking about. But first, I want to start with a story. So some of you may have heard this, and my apologies if I'm going over material you already know. So in late August 2020, the Faculty of Law had a committee looking for a new director for the International Human Rights Program there. And this was a somewhat embattled program. So finding a new director was very important, was a top priority for those who were on the committee. And the committee had selected its preferred candidate, a major human rights lawyer, Dr. Valentina Azarova, and they were in the process of making a formal offer. And that's when an email was sent. And this email was sent by the director of an organization called NGO Monitor, which is directed by a professor of political science at Bar-Ilan University, an Israeli university, Gerald Steinberg. And he sent this email to the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs with a memorandum about Azarova. And I'll just quote one of the paragraphs, which was discovered afterwards through when there was an inquiry into the judge who interfered with the hiring. If someone could quietly find out the current status and confirm Azarova's pending appointment, that would be very helpful. The hope is that through quiet discussions, top university officials will realize that this appointment is academically unworthy. Just note that Azarova is a world-famous scholar of human rights, and especially the Israeli human rights violations, and that a public protest campaign will do major damage to the university, including in fundraising. So the next thing we know, a former director of CIJA and a major bundler for the Faculty of Law, that is in donations, is contacted, who then speaks to someone at the Faculty of Law and possibly also the dean, and the search is canceled. The University of Toronto, where I work, is eventually censured until it reopened the search and made an offer to Azarova. Azarova turned it down. We feel probably because she could not be guaranteed academic freedom. Now, I bring this up because NGO monitors and CIJA's interference shows a pattern about how Canadian foreign policy works with respect to the state of Israel. How is this related? How is this story related to the claim about the so-called new anti-Semitism? Both before and during this affair, and to this day, Israel lobby organizations like CIJA, B'nai B'rith Canada, and so on, have pushed government and educational institutions to adopt a definition of anti-Semitism known as the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance Working Definition, or IHRA, or as I'm going to call it, the IRA definition. Now, IRA is a final codification from 2016 about this claim of a new anti-Semitism. And it's especially used against Palestinian solidarity movements, for example, BDS, which Jamila mentioned. So for the rest of my time, I'm going to focus on the emergence of this concept of the new anti-Semitism and tie it to a new phase in the settler colonial project of the Israeli state. I'm going to historicize very briefly. I cut this talk down from 20 to hopefully 12 minutes. So I hope it's not too jumpy and that you'll be able to follow. So it's important to historicize and understand better this concept, since it is a major strategy today to deny, censor, and silence Palestinian history and Palestinian solidarity movements over the last 100 years. Here, I'm relying on the one hand, especially on the work of Amy Kaplan, John Mearsheimer, and Stephen Walt, and Anthony Lerman about the history of the concept. And on the other hand, I'm relying on my own knowledge of the history of Palestine, Israel. I think it is important to understand how this concept emerged in order to determine how to fight real anti-Semitism. And I think we would all agree that we want a anti-racism strategy that combines efforts against Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, Sinophobia, and other forms of racism, as well as anti-Semitism, and how to avoid false accusations of anti-Semitism when we're talking about legitimate public criticism and peaceful protest movements. And especially, it should concern us how the concept, the new anti-Semitism, can be used to propagate and defend other forms of racism and bigotry, like anti-Palestinian racism and Islamophobia. I'm not going to go into the IHRA or IRA working definition at length, but it is a very controversial one among experts, including Jewish and Israeli scholars, because it includes criticisms of the Israeli state as 7 out of 11 examples. Essentially, the concept of the new anti-Semitism is that the state of Israel is the, quote, collective Jew in international arenas. And for those of you who know Canadian history, I believe it was Erwin Kotler who actually came up with that phrase, the collective Jew. And no one should call into question its present form as a state which upholds the rights of Jewish residents at the expense of Palestinians. So the apartheid policies which were mentioned before. Any such questioning or criticism of the way the institutions and politics of the Israeli state function to maintain the rights of Jewish people as superior is considered anti-Semitic by this concept of the new anti-Semitism. So here I'll just take a moment to note that this weaponization of the idea of anti-Semitism has been opposed by many experts, many Canadian scholars, many Canadian intellectuals more broadly, Since here I'm kind of representing the Jewish Faculty Network, more than 210 Jewish faculty from across Canadian colleges and universities who have signed their names to a letter against this kind of weaponization. Now, you won't generally find the proponents of the new anti-Semitism saying that. What they say is, that's anti-Semitic, or they'll use a similar expression. Often the terminology is that, quote, Israel is being held to a higher standard, or, quote, Israel is being singled out, or, quote, delegitimized, or that the expression or person betrays a, quote, anti-Israel animus. This is what was said about Dr. Azarova, is that because her scholarship focused on human rights violations of Palestinians by the Israeli state, that somehow showed a anti-Israel animus, not that she was interested in human rights law in this context. Now, there's a second aspect to the adoption of the concept, which is almost more important than what the definition, the IRA definition is, or its examples, and that is the institutional use of the concept. The organized proponents of the new anti-Semitism, what Mearsheimer and Walt call the Israel lobby, want to be the official arbiters of what counts as anti-Semitism when IRA is adopted. They don't want to acknowledge that there is a debate among Jewish experts and leaders about the concept. They just want you and all of us to accept their authority. They just want to make themselves judges of what counts as anti-Semitism and to institutionalize their authority in a quasi-legal manner, right? So what they'll generally say is that groups like Jewish Faculty Network, people like me, are somehow fringe. We're not important. We don't really represent the Jewish community here in Canada, which is all false, by the way. There's a very large range of, a very large diversity of Jewish opinion on all these matters among Jewish Canadians. Now, I'd like to examine the relation of the concept of the new anti-Semitism to the history of the State of Israel. This is where I really shortened the history. I can't get into a lot of detail, but it isn't possible to understand the legitimation of the State of Israel without thinking through a history of racisms and racial hierarchies that are implemented through colonial regimes. Historically, like the Canadian state, as my panelists have noted, my co-panelists, that is, the State of Israel is a settler colonial endeavor that emerged out of a British colonial state, and it maintains several aspects of that colonial apparatus. The settler colonial project only really begins with the British conquest in 1917 and the establishment of a colonial mandate over Palestine. It's in the British period, which lasted up until 1948, that Zionist settlement and institutions of rule were built up. And then, as a result of British favoring the Zionist institutions during the 1948 war, there was a mass expulsion and exile of upwards of 750,000 Palestinian Arabs, an event known by Palestinians as the Nakba. Now, on the morrow of the Nakba, the State of Israel formed on 78% of what was Mandate Palestine and gained international recognition for that phase of the settler colonial project, largely through the UN and the support of the British and especially the American governments. Now, I'm going to jump to this 1967 war, when the Israelis conquered new lands from Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and which caused more expulsions and more exiles, not only of Palestinians, but also of Syrians. At that moment, the Israeli government immediately moved its system of military rule from the 1948 territories to the 1967 territories, which are known as the West Bank, the Gaza Strip today. Now, the 1960s were also an important period of global decolonization. So while Israel is starting a new military kind of regime over stateless Palestinians, especially in the occupied territories, there's this huge push for decolonization, the emergence of a new left, new civil rights movements are gaining in power around the North Atlantic and around the world, which are also including growing condemnations of imperialism and colonialism, like that of the Israeli state, or American imperial actions in, for example, in Vietnam. This is also the period where the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, becomes a separate entity that becomes the representative, the kind of genuine representative, authentic representative of the Palestinian people wherever they may be. But there was something else happening in the 1960s, which is important to understand the kind of domination of a certain way of understanding the Israeli state today. Amy Kaplan has described this for the US, but I suspect it is generalizable for North Atlantic countries more generally. Israel became a kind of hero in dominant US public opinion. This happened during a time when there were huge debates about American imperialism during the Vietnam War, especially in the context of the Cold War between the US-led order and the Soviet-led sphere. Speaking about the Israeli victory in the 1967 war, Kaplan writes, the dramatic action of Israeli soldiers during the 1967 war, averting apocalypse, had a cathartic effect. In Israel's swift victory over Soviet allies, especially Egypt and Syria, Americans could vicariously experience both the dread of vulnerability and the thrill of invisibility, the irrefutable victory that was eluding them in Vietnam. So in the context, it's in that context that the term the new anti-Semitism, or sometimes functional anti-Semitism, emerged and was promulgated. As Anthony Lerman shows, after the 1967 war and with growing support for the so-called Zionism is Racism UN resolution, that led to the first round of redefining and discussing criticism of the Israeli state, labeling such criticisms as anti-Semitic. That is, the concept of the new anti-Semitism arose as a response to criticism of a new phase in the Israeli settler colonial project, the post-67 moment, to expand its settlement in particular to the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, although it also expanded to Gaza and other conquered territories. So, for instance, an early expression by Israel's then foreign minister, Abba Eban, who stated in 1973, recently we have witnessed the rise of the new left, which identifies Israel with the establishment, with acquisition, with smug satisfaction, with, in fact, all the basic enemies. Let there be no mistake. The new left is the author and the progenitor of the new anti-Semitism. One of the chief tasks of any dialogue with the Gentile world is to prove that the distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is not a distinction at all. Anti-Zionism is merely the new anti-Semitism. This could be written today. It's being written as we speak by politicians, by major commentators in the media, and by the Israel lobby organizations as we speak today. The old classic anti-Semitism declared that equal rights belong to all individuals within the society except the Jews. The new anti-Semitism says that the right to establish and maintain an independent national sovereign state is the prerogative of all nations, so long as they happen not to be Jewish. Okay, so there you have, like, you really see how it's in this moment when the Israeli leadership decides that they want to colonize the rest of Palestine with settlements, that here getting blowback from the new left, from all of these decolonizing movements, leads to this concept being mobilized and put into kind of foreign policy, as we saw with that original example from the University of Toronto. So Lerman argues that the final codification of this concept comes later, with events after 9/11 and the Second Intifada, and finally with the IRA working definition. Now, where do you see this concept used? And this will be the final things that I have to say. Well, especially it targets BDS and other Palestinian solidarity movements, or NGO reports like of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, that discuss how the state of Israel has committed crimes of apartheid and now of genocide. All of this is called anti-Semitic. The state of Israel, along with its most prominent organized allies abroad, have instrumentalized, weaponized the charge of anti-Semitism in order to silence those activities. IRA, the new anti-Semitism, are then concepts which impact Canadian foreign policy as a mechanism to securitize speech within Canada about the state of Israel. And as we heard before from the other panelists, they have a huge effect, especially on certain populations. In case it needs to be said, evidence-based discussion of the ongoing settler colonial enterprise that is the State of Israel is not anti-Semitic. It is absolutely legitimate to criticize any part of a colonial project. And as we see now more than ever, we need decolonization as soon as possible. Thank you so much. Sorry if I went a little bit too long.
Thank you, Alejandro. Can you stop sharing your screen there for a sec? Very good. Thank you so much for, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time left for a free-ranging discussion, but let me just sort of try to put together some questions that people asked in the chat in a way that sort of hopefully we can help tie some things together. And several questions in the chat noted that Canadian anti-racist groups generally don't focus on foreign relations, and quite clearly we see here a need to decolonize not only Canada domestically, but in terms of its foreign policy. And so one of the questions I think that emerges for all of us is, how do we actually go about doing that? And especially, how do we build alliances between different groups and organizations to enable this to happen? I don't know if people, it's a huge question, and I know if I had the answer to that, I'd win the Nobel Prize, but I don't know if you, anybody, if you have some thoughts on that. Is it too big a question?
I can try to start maybe, and then well, I think, yes, when I was talking, for example, about Islamophobia, I mentioned the case of Afghanistan. I mentioned the case mainly of Canada, but I didn't mention the case of foreign policy, for instance. And one of the things that Canada has been doing very well, not in a good sense, actually, is, for instance, when it comes to its relationship with Saudi Arabia, for example, there is this double sort of image. On one hand, we despise everything that has to do with what they call barbaric, the faith aspect, the misogyny, the oppression of women, and we linked it somehow to Islam, right? But at the same time, it is our ally when it comes to selling weapons, to sell, commercial, so any sort of commercial interest working over there. So I think it's very this idea of how Islamophobia can be part of those foreign sort of relationship. So we continue those relationships as long as it suits us, but then we keep Saudi Arabia when it comes to demonize Islam, when it comes to call it as, the terrorism provider or whatsoever. I think, so for example, we have this whole feminist foreign policy, or this feminist policy that Canada is very proud to brag about it on the international scene. But then when it comes to Palestinian women, their rights, we have seen during this war or this genocide on Gaza, I'd rather say, most of the victims are women and children. Nobody really cared about them. Actually, we provided the arms and the weapons to Israel to kill. So when we hear about pregnant women having C-section, without anesthesia, when we have women who are, so these type of foreign policy where it's clearly today hypocritical, double standard, we use it more to colonize. We use it more as an imperialist tool to basically, at the same time, be winning from the arm and from the weapons, but at the same time to keep some countries always in a position of inferiority, right? So women, Palestinian women, do not even deserve to be saved or to have this sort of rights that Afghan women would have, right? So I think this is maybe where I will focus. We need really a foreign policy more entrenched into the respect of human rights, the respect for all, and the respect also for I forgot I was going to say human rights and also something else, but anyway, it will come later on.
Do the other panelists have some final thoughts they'd like to share?
I'll just add one small thing. I think Monia, when you were talking about Islamophobia, you said something about security and like how security is actually is being used like to justify the exclusion or like, let's say, all the discrimination against one group of people for the sake of another. And I feel like so far, like safety is something that has been like a state discourse or like conservative discourse. And it's something that we as like, let's say, anti-racist advocates or like anti-racist researchers should reclaim and should actually like probably start, I don't know, like also like include it in our like racism, not to criticize it, but at the same time, like is a concept that we could also like use. And it could be actually like an important thing to start building bridges between different anti-racist groups, because like I'm sure like that Sinophobia and like Islamophobia and like Antisemitism and Anti-Palestinian racism, they all actually would fall under the issue of safety at some point. And we could all like join efforts together. And one more thing, since Canada is still colonialism, I feel like the issue of Indigenous people is something that we could all also like embrace at some point and also build effort based on it and build alliances. Because like no one is talking about it. We're just talking about like anti-Palestinian racism or like Islamophobia, blah, 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 etc. Sorry. But also like we all live in unceded territories, and at the same time we all live, and those people are probably the most excluded group of people that we all need to start acknowledge and look also work more with on a systemic and institutional base, like on all levels as well, and include it in our anti-racism programs. And maybe we use it to build alliances as well. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah, thank you for those questions and those answers. I think also that it's panels like this. I mean, I think that this kind of organizing where you don't just have, I mean, what the sieges of the world want to do is just talk about anti-Semitism as if there's no other kind of form of racism that needs to be addressed. And as if they don't have to worry about the forms of racism, like Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian racism, that they conjure as they talk about anti-Semitism. So I think this kind of event, this kind of approach to anti-racism strategies that seek to connect the dots, also with xenophobia, is really important. I wanted to say one thing just about the problem of speaking about foreign policy, that part of the question. At least in terms of speaking about Palestine, you know, the Palestine exception is extremely powerful across our governing and media and educational institutions. And so wherever you happen to be in the world, you know, there's efforts like what Jamila was explaining of trying to get anti-Palestinian racism accepted, for example, at the local school board as something that needs to be addressed, or to have, I know in our school boards here in the GTA, there's efforts to have Nakba Remembrance Day so that students can learn about what happened. And this is something that many Jewish parents and Jewish families like mine are also advocating for. And that's in that moment that you, by working together, that you create the kinds of alliances. It doesn't have to always impact immediately, the Canadian foreign policy kind of documents. It can be something that happens very locally, and you create the conditions for being able to see how our struggles are united, and that none of us is liberated until all of us are liberated. And I don't think those are just fancy words. I think that that's basically that's the only thing that can guide us at a moment like this when we're watching a genocide, which I shouldn't have to say it, but I will say it. It's not in my name. This has nothing to do with my Judaism or the Judaism of my family. Yeah.
Well, that's almost, I think we should end on that note. Let me just sort of emphasize, I think one of the things that we know that allows people to overcome racism is when they are brought together around common projects. And suddenly the what seem to be major absolute distances disappear. And I think, as been suggested, one of those common projects can be to ensure the security and safety of all people, because we know that that's something that the racists feed into and feed on. And frankly, it's also the kinds of things that has been shaping Canadian and indeed the foreign policies of other countries of late, that sort of creating these others that we fear. And the way we counter that is through discussion, exchange, and getting together on common things. So with that in mind, I want to thank the panelists today for joining with us in this common project of at least this panel. And I hope that in future we can continue to some of these discussions that are starting today. It falls on me to thank a number of people for making this session possible. So one of the people I'd like to thank is Brenda Mazigh for having organized, brought us all together, done the actual organization of the panel. John Price for having roped us all into doing it, and for promoting the idea. Jessica McVicker for having promoted it. Canada-China Focus needs to acknowledge as well its support from the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and the Centre for Global Studies at the University of Victoria. And with that in mind, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this panel and wish you success in your future endeavors.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim and Bianca and Jessica. And Monia and Jamila, hope to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Nice to see you too.
Thank all of
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you. Yeah.